So we're kicking off this very seminar today and this thematic block with no one less than Kate Dommett. We're so happy to have you here today, Kate. I'm just going to briefly introduce you and then hand over to you. So Kate is a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield. She has a sparkling track record on publications on political parties, political advertising, digital campaigning, and data and democracy. She recently served as a special advisor to the House of Lords Committee on Democracy and Digital Technology. In 2020, Kate received the Richard Rose Prize by the Political Studies Association, and she published her book in the same year, The Reimagined Party, in Manchester University Press. So please look up Kate's work, look up her book and her fantastic publications. So again, Kate, we're so happy to have you here today. You know you have around 30 minutes for your presentation, so the screen is yours.
Oh, thank you so much for such a kind introduction, and I'm really excited to be able to give a presentation to you, and hopefully at some point I'll make it out to Canberra to actually get to meet you in person. So I will share my screen and dive right in. Okay. Right, so I will give a bit of background to this talk just to give a little bit of context. So this presentation is going to be based on a publication I've written with my colleague Peter Borowczyk, and he is essentially the expert in deliberative democracy. So complete cards on the table, as you kind of probably gathered from the introduction. I am not a democratic theorist, but I'm someone who is really interested in democratic theory and the insights that it can offer. I guess my background and perspective on this paper is very much, I have a real interest in digital technology and how that is shaping society. And I'm particularly interested in how democratic institutions and processes are adapting to consider and accommodate digital technology within society. And kind of through that work, it's led me to think a lot more in theoretical terms around different conceptions of democracy. And this project was essentially about the process of doing that, taking the very kind of practical and empirical questions that I was encountering through my work, and having conversations with Peter about the insights that we could gather through theoretical scholarship, and particularly work around deliberative democracy. And so we kind of came up with this idea of trying to write something that was mobilizing academic insights and bringing them to bear on some of the kind of practical policy questions that I was confronting. So as Hans was saying, I had the opportunity to go and work in the House of Lords for a year, working with a group of policymakers to try and kind of consider what was going on with democracy and technology, and to kind of try and come up with some recommendations and some practical policy interventions. And that process was so illuminating and interesting. But I guess as part of stepping back from that and stepping out of the tumult of producing recommendations, I was really struck by what that experience had been like, and it felt quite unsatisfactory to me. And so it kind of fueled this desire to do a bit of work thinking about, well, what actually are we trying to achieve here? And are the kind of dynamics of the current policy debate actually useful for purpose? So let me dive straight in. What I'm going to argue today is that much of the recent debate about the impact of technology on society has been like chasing and whacking moles. So what do I mean by that? So if you think about public discourse around technology and democracy, it's kind of likely that you will think of a series of scandals or a series of harms or threats that have emerged in public consciousness. So in my work, and I largely study the use of tech around elections, it was kind of catalysed by Cambridge Analytica, this big scandal that suddenly everyone was incredibly concerned about. So we have things like Cambridge Analytica, but there's also been concerns around polarisation, around online harms, around misinformation, disinformation and fake news, around privacy and the role of digital tech in eroding individual privacy, around micro-targeting, around like poor levels of digital literacy, around foreign interference in elections or manipulation. And the one thing that I want you to take away from this talk, if it's just one thing, is that we need to stop chasing moles. We need to stop focusing on the threats and having a very reactive approach to the latest scandal or challenge. And then we need to think instead about the kind of environment that we want to create in terms of digital technology and democracy. And in order to do so, the approach I took with Peter was to think about, well, what literatures can we draw on, like what insights, what should we be thinking about in order to get away from this really reactive approach? How can you try and reset that debate, and what would that look like? And so we drew upon the two different literatures that we came from. So on the one hand, we have this amazingly rich scholarship on democratic ideals that offers us an incredibly utopian vision of what we should be striving to create within society. So full disclosure, this is my utopia, which is the top of the Col de Pré in the Alps, where I got to cycle a few years ago. And I think we've got an amazing literature that really helps us understand what we want from democracy and what the practices look like, not least in the deliberative tradition, but a whole range of different scholarship there. And I think there is interestingly quite a rich strand of that work that has looked at the relationship between democracy and technology. And there's a number of scholars that you can draw on to really kind of understand how these two phenomena can intertwine to really create a democratic system in which we kind of envision that we will thrive as individuals and as society as a whole. Now, what's interesting from my perspective, and especially being within the policymaking environment over the last few years, is that this utopian vision, this kind of discussion of democratic ideals is just absent. It's just not part of what policymakers are thinking about, to the point where I even, as the, exercising my academic license in the room, asked policymakers what they were trying to achieve, like what was the democratic good they were trying to achieve, and they couldn't articulate it. And we actually ended up doing a follow-up bit of work that I did with Daniel Crease at UNC and Bridget Barrett, which was trying to look at what were the democratic goals that policymakers were articulating around democracy, around technology, sorry. And that basically showed that their ideas were very fragmented, they were often quite contradictory, and they hadn't really thought through the relationship between isolated democratic principles and a broader vision of society. And that meant that the kind of interactions that they were promoting were creating real tensions and difficulties in actually solving the problem, because there wasn't a kind of coherent vision of what they were trying to achieve. So we have this kind of democratic ideal, and I do think that's incredibly important, but it's absent. But then there's this second literature, and this is kind of more where I originate from, I suppose, and I would now probably classify myself as a political communications scholar, because I think that has ended up speaking more closely to my work than a lot of political science does. And if you look at what's coming out of this body of work, it is a lot of empirical findings. So empirical studies of what is going on the internet, why we should be concerned. And frankly, this is where a lot of that really concerning discourse I started with originates from. So, evidence of echo chambers or filter bubbles or fake news or misinformation that is coming largely out of political communication scholarship. And it is raising a lot of concerns. Now, what's interesting is this kind of research is incredibly prominent within the policymaking discourse. And I routinely found quite a high degree of familiarity amongst the policymakers that I was interacting with the latest findings that's coming out of this empirical research. So this is very, very dominant. And I think it's kind of interesting to feel that schism between those two bodies of literature and those two traditions of thinking about essentially the same kind of problem, which is, what is happening with technology and what implications has that got for democracy? And is there a reason to be concerned? There's a kind of common interest in those two questions across these literatures. So that was kind of the backdrop to our insight into this question. And then we started thinking about, well, why is this, like, what is the challenge that is being faced by policymakers? And I think, you know, I was very aware that policymakers were really trying to do something about these problematic trends. They really wanted to regulate big technology, but they also were finding it incredibly difficult to do that. And I think this is partly because of the nature of digital technology itself. So it's very fast moving. It's very difficult to pin down, largely because it's often developed outside of national jurisdictions. And so it's kind of a lot of the regulatory instruments or the fetters that we've been able to have on previously domestic institutions or phenomena don't really work around digital technology. So there's quite a lot of reasons why it's hard, but there didn't seem to be a reason for why policymakers were kind of lurching from one latest scandal to another. It felt like there was a really reactive dynamic to policymaking, and just kind of landing on the latest area of concern rather than doing that more longer term, and what we ended up kind of calling more proactive policy making to try and actively cultivate the kind of democratic sphere in which technology was facilitating a democratic goal that was wanted, rather than creating concerns and undermining democracy as it exists. And I think we became really interested in this challenge. And in part, the paper became an attempt to kind of understand why policymakers were stuck in these dynamics, and then to think about an alternative approach. So I'm going to take you through why we think this challenge has emerged and why it's so difficult, and why there's a problem with just relying on that more empirical strand of literature which is currently happening. So way back in the dawn of time, when I was doing a postdoc, I ended up studying like evidence-based policymaking and administrative processes. And that really showed a kind of strong interest amongst the policymaking community in using empirical insights to inform policymaking interventions. So, you know, it's found internationally, and there's a really strong desire to have experts come into policymaking spheres and offer insights in terms of guiding policy. And indeed, that's kind of the role that I was performing within the Lords, was helping to take to them the latest academic findings around the impact of technology on democracy and what we might want to do about it. But the problem with that is, if you look at the empirical literature that's coming out around the impact of technology on democracy, it is really confused at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to navigate. So we decided to focus on two particular phenomena to kind of illustrate the challenges of using evidence to try and make policy in this space, and using just that alone. And that was the debates around echo chambers and around filter bubbles, which were incredibly prominent and were a real focus of the policymakers that I was working with. So echo chambers, I'm sure this is an idea that you're all incredibly familiar with, but essentially it's about the way that the internet can dramatically increase the ability of people to kind of hear similar perspectives and not be exposed to alternative views. So it's an idea that originated with the work of Cass Sunstein, and has been really quite magnified, and has become a very commonly referred to idea within the literature and within kind of popular understanding of the dynamics of the internet. And I think this phenomenon was seen to be particularly challenging because it was seen to really kind of put people in closed spaces with like-minded individuals, and through this process of kind of you know, hearing the same idea again, you know, not being exposed to different perspectives, that it was kind of really fragmenting society, and we were ending up with almost like little pockets of people who were no longer being exposed to ideas beyond their own. So we were really interested in this idea, so we decided to kind of do a review of the empirical studies that were had emerged around this topic. And what we found was that there were a range of studies to support these ideas. So just to give you an example, There was a study looking at interactions on Twitter in the US, and they developed a classificatory framework, and they showed that US Democrats were consistently more likely to have a large percentage of friends with the same affiliation. And we also found a whole load of survey data that confirmed this. So just another example, a study by Pew said that 1 in 4 Facebook users had hidden, blocked, or defriended or stopped following someone on a social network based on disagreements over political posts. So these kind of ideas that people were, you know, really closing off their exposure to alternative perspectives and ending up with quite a closed community that was quite reinforcing and already aligned to their own ideas. And yet, that wasn't the only finding. We also found a really rich strand of literature which was arguing that the echo chamber was overstated. So Elizabeth Dubois and Grant Blank have particularly pioneered this work, and they found that people regularly encounter things that they disagree with on the internet, that people check multiple sources of news, that they try and confirm information that they encounter online, and that they discover things that are different from their own political opinions. And that, again, there were a large range of studies that were seen to be confirming this. So looking at this kind of empirical evidence, we were kind of left with the conclusion, well, it's kind of no surprising. It's not surprising that policymakers don't really know quite what to do faced with this. And so they end up kind of lurching around, following what they think is the latest evidence. But actually, there's kind of not really a clear sense of what is going on. So this is a quote that was in the Lords Committee report that I was working for. And it's not something I wrote, thankfully, someone else did. But it was really challenging the UK government, which at that point were citing evidence of echo chambers and filter bubbles as a justification for their online harms legislation. And it was kind of saying, well, actually, the evidence that this phenomena exists actually doesn't really seem to be that compelling. So it was kind of challenging the idea that they were making policy on the basis of evidence by kind of saying, well, that evidence is actually quite mixed, and therefore that approach, you know, might not be the wisest approach to just follow this empirical evidence that's slightly unreliable. So we kind of felt that there was, on this front, basis to kind of say, well, we can't just rely on empirical evidence alone and kind of swing from the latest challenge from one another. And we also decided to kind of see what was happening in the debate around filter bubbles. So this is kind of a similar phenomenon. So it's talking about the way that we encounter information online, but it particularly focuses on personalized filtering systems. So things like, you know, if you use Google search, for example, it will return search results to you that are more aligned with your natural ideological perspective. And therefore the internet and what you're seeing is filtered according to pre-existing preferences that you might have in a way that you're not conscious of. So there's a lot of concern around this. Similarly, we found conflicting evidence. So we had studies finding that search engines do indeed lead to higher ideological segregation than if you just search directly for a news provider. Whereas on the other hand, we had studies that were showing that a preference for kind of cognate news or something that agrees with you doesn't necessarily result in a willingness to engage less with alternative perspectives. So we're saying that, you know, yes, potentially some of the internet creates filter bubbles, but it's not as simple as that. There's other things going on. People are still seeing other perspectives. Some parts of the internet don't filter in this way. So this kind of led to a series of conclusions from some people saying that, you know, although people are worried about filter bubbles, they're kind of, it's potentially once again overstated, and that people are developing strategies or they're using alternative news providers which allow this to come away. So what's the takeaway from this kind of empirical overview? I think it's that essentially empirical studies of trends online do not lead to consensus, firstly about what is the problem, but secondly about what solutions can remedy that problem. And for us, that just meant, and I felt particularly strongly about this, is that it's not sufficient to rely on empirical studies and the insights of political communication, particularly alone. There needs to be this blending of empirical insights and theory. So that's kind of where deliberative democracy comes in. Now, full disclosure, as I mentioned at the start, I am not an expert in deliberative democracy, but I think the ideas have long fascinated me, and I think it's a really interesting tradition of thought to explore. Peter, my colleague, is an expert in Habermas's work in particular. And so what we decided to use was use deliberative democracy as an illustrative example in order to think through how you could entwine theory and empirics and more applied studies to kind of think about more what we ended up calling really proactive ways of intervening in this policy debate and trying to think about the public sphere in quite a proactive way. So to grossly oversimplify, we ended up settling on two principles of like the coffee house culture in particular. So that was the desire to have diverse communities in which there's a public sphere that brings together a diverse cross-section of individuals, but also common knowledge. So rather than fragmented knowledge systems, have access to public sources of information that allowed a basis of shared discussion. So we took those two principles and started to think through, well, what would it mean if you were more proactively seeking to promote those principles? How can we apply those to the empirical studies that we've been reviewing? And how do they speak to one another? Like, is it possible to entwine them? And what we ended up arguing is that there seems to be aspects of the digital sphere and the digital architecture that was being studied by the empirical studies that in certain instances were more or less conducive and amenable to the principles that we were identifying within the tradition of deliberative democracy. And in particular, we focused on the potential to alter or think about two aspects of digital technology. So the first was digital design, and the second was user behaviour. So I've got a summary kind of table here, which I'll talk through each part. But essentially, we were kind of thinking through, well, you don't necessarily need to just be reactive and go, we've got filter bubbles, how do we intervene to regulate, to stop filter bubbles, or, you know, to get platforms to be disclosing their algorithms so we understand the filtering that's going on. It's like, well, actually, could you step back and can we think about digital design, or can we think about equipping citizens with the tools or mechanisms and proactively creating infrastructure that promotes the diverse communities that we think are essential to the democratic public sphere, or that help to facilitate the use of common knowledge. So we went and had a look back through those studies of evidence that these principles might be a way of guiding a more proactive approach to policy making. So to look at the first, we first looked at digital design. Now, this is something that's kind of come to prominence in recent years. Particularly Jennifer Forrestal's written an absolutely excellent article that I thoroughly recommend, that is looking at the relationship between design and democratic politics. And I just love this quote. It's so obvious, but I think all the best academic insights are just so good at really crystallizing something that hasn't been said before. And she was saying, you know, the design of digital platforms can have enormous implications for how and how well we collectively practice democratic politics. And I think that really resonated with a lot of what we were finding. And we kind of felt that actually, you know, you could take that principle and then look at those empirical studies again and go, well, do we see instances in which the design of the digital architecture that's being studied is actually promoting these values that we want to see? So we went back through the studies and looked around for evidence that online public debate could be like facilitated to promote these principles we want to see. So just to kind of cite one study, it's one by Halpin and Gibbs, showed that some social media channels may be better suited for deliberation than others. And they said that when users are automatically notified about content generation in their networks, more people contribute and the debate is not as dominated by specific individuals. So they were pointing to a particular design attribute that they were studying that seems to allow more diverse communities to contribute to the online sphere. Similarly, in another study, we showed that it explored the different affordances of Twitter and Facebook, and it said that depending on the environment in which they were interacting, people shifted the manner and the tone of their comments, which meant that in certain spheres, deliberative attributes like linking to supporting material or using numbers and statistics to support one's point or offering a legitimate counter-argument were more frequent on Facebook than they were on Twitter. So we have studies that seem to be showing that the architecture that exists can help us create certain kinds of environments for interaction. And for us, they help to create certain kinds of democratic public spheres. So this kind of led us to start thinking, well, this means that rather than focusing on whacking moles, in my terms, or shutting down the latest threat, maybe we need to be thinking about forms of design that could promote these types of democratic intervention. And so we made an attempt to kind of think of some of the things that potentially you could do. And this is very much a start of attempt, but I think we were particularly interested in thinking about, could you design particular forums that could encourage deliberation? So, things like having like notifications, like was mentioned in that examples, or could you try and arrange publics in a way that brought together more diverse communities, so that people were encountering those with different perspectives more readily, or being put in direct interaction with people that they might not encounter in other walks of life? Could you be promoting sources of references to create that kind of common knowledge and infrastructure where people are referring to the same sources within a particular digital architecture? So these are kind of very much start of 10 ideas, but we think there's potential there, and it's definitely something that is starting to be explored by companies themselves. So we know, for example, that Facebook are looking at how they can tweak their design to promote democratic virtues and try and limit less positive democratic behaviours. We similarly kind of did the same with user behaviour. So again, we found a lot of evidence that user behaviour could be influenced to kind of create certain types of democratic interactions within the existing literature. So Christian Vaccaro, for example, has talked about how individuals select online content and sources, and they're more likely to seek agreement than disagreement on social media. So there's this idea implicit in his work that people are exercising choice, they have agency in that space, and that can be therefore shaped, and potentially the government could be trying to influence how people navigate the online sphere. Elsewhere, scholars are kind of pointed to the fact that people are actively choosing diverse media. They're not just passive consumers. So this kind of speaks to a whole massive body of literature around digital literacy and about how you equip citizens with skills to navigate the online world. And there is potential to do that. So, again, thinking about our principles, could you teach individuals about how the online landscape works to kind of increase awareness about potential segregation, which has been shown in some studies to lead people to seek out more diverse communities? Can you actually do the kind of training that we've seen offline in deliberative spaces, sometimes about trying to equip people with certain skills in terms of how they engage online? Could you do something like create member-based enforcement of democratic norms? So, spaces like Wikipedia or Reddit that are regulated by the community, and they create very strong norms of how conduct should be conducted online that are self-reinforcing. Could you try and create more environments where there is this peer observation and investment in sustaining certain goals? So essentially, to kind of bring this to a close, I want to kind of circle back to where I started, which is that at the moment, there is a real focus on just shutting down the latest problem, and a real fear of digital technology and the negative impacts it's having on society. But as we kind of see policymakers move towards pushing through some fairly chunky bits of legislation, especially in the European Union, got the Online Harms Bill in the UK, what we're kind of advocating for is less a focus on reactive harm prevention and for more time to be spent thinking about those democratic ideals, which could be deliberative, but they could be of many different forms. But what we think is absolutely essential is that you do think about the relationship between theory and the empirical practice, and there are more attempts to bridge that gap between scholars who are working on a more theoretical level and those who are doing more empirically grounded studies, to really think about, you know, what are the underpinning infrastructures, or what are the conditions in which desirable goals can be advanced. Now, that's a kind of very much going to be a big project to do that kind of thinking and testing, to actually identify potential solutions and to have a look at how they can be manifest in practice. But we think this kind of helps shift the debate towards a more proactive approach, and to really think about encouraging policymakers to devote more attention to what it is that they're striving to create, and to really think about what is the democratic good that they're trying to protect, and how can you proactively push that through the policymaking interventions to shape the kind of public sphere that we want to see. So I will leave it there, and thank you ever so much. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.